Confessions before the execution. January 24th, 1989. While most of America was still shrouded in darkness, hundreds of people gathered outside Florida State Prison. Some carried signs, some cheered, others simply stood in silence, waiting for the moment when one of America's most notorious men would be executed. Inside the prison, Ted Bundy was living through the final hours of his life. He was 42 years old. He had spent nearly a decade on death row, and he faced 3 death sentences for the murders of 3 victims in Florida. But, as the time of his execution drew closer, something strange began to happen. After years of denial, years of lies, and years of trying to control everyone around him, Ted Bundy began to confess. Investigators from Washington, Utah, Colorado, and Idaho arrived in Florida, one after another. Each of them carried old case files, faded photographs, maps, and the names of women who had disappeared more than a decade earlier. They wanted to know what had happened, where the victims had been taken, and most importantly, whether there were still families waiting for someone who would never return. Bundy began providing information, but he did not reveal everything at once. He gave them one name at a time, one location, one small detail, enough to convince investigators that he knew the truth, but never enough for them to close every case. Some of his confessions matched what the police already knew. Some led investigators to locations that had never been made public, but there were also stories that could not be verified. Victims without names, bodies that were never found, and unanswered questions that Ted Bundy carried with him to the electric chair. In the end, he confessed to murdering approximately 30 people across 7 states, but no one knows whether that was the whole truth. The real number may have been higher, or perhaps Bundy deliberately exaggerated certain details to preserve the terrifying image he had created. Because even in his final hours, Bundy was still doing what he had done throughout his life, controlling the narrative, controlling the information, and forcing everyone to wait for what he would say next. But the biggest question surrounding Ted Bundy was not simply the number of his victims. It was how he had managed to conceal who he truly was. Bundy did not live apart from society. He attended college, he worked in politics, he volunteered at a crisis counseling center, he had a girlfriend, and many people saw him as a polite, educated young man with a promising future. He could walk into an office without raising suspicion. He could speak to the police without appearing afraid. He could stand in a courtroom and conduct himself like a lawyer, and he could convince a stranger that he was simply someone in need of help. So when did the real Ted Bundy begin to emerge? Why did the people around him fail to recognize who he truly was? Why did the police receive Bundy's name so early, yet still fail to stop his string of crimes? And why, decades after his death, do people continue to debate the secrets he never revealed? To find the answers, the story must go back more than 40 years before the trials, before the 2 prison escapes, before the name Ted Bundy became known across America, to a time when he was still just a young man with a perfectly ordinary face. The making of a man with 2 faces. Ted Bundy was born on November 24, 1946, in Burlington, Vermont. His birth name was Theodore Robert Cowell. From the earliest years of his life, Bundy's family was surrounded by secrets that would later become the subject of countless books and documentaries. The identity of his biological father was never clearly established. For a time, Bundy was raised by his maternal grandparents. Later, his mother moved to Tacoma, Washington, where she began a new life and married Johnny Bundy. From that point on, Theodore Cowell carried the Bundy name. Many stories about his childhood would emerge. Years later, some described Bundy as a lonely child, socially awkward, sensitive to ridicule. Others claimed that he showed an unusual fascination with violence from an early age. But most of these stories surfaced only after Bundy had become a notorious killer. They were told through the memories of people who already knew how his story would end. And so, it is difficult to determine which details were genuine warning signs and which were ordinary childhood behaviors, reinterpreted through the lens of his later crimes. No single event from his childhood can fully explain the person Ted Bundy became. Millions of people have grown up in complicated families, experienced rejection, felt alone, but they did not become killers. What is more significant is how Bundy learned to create different versions of himself. As he entered adulthood, he could appear shy in one situation, confident in another. He could present himself as a serious student, a dedicated volunteer, or a young man preparing for a career in politics. Bundy attended the University of Washington. After changing his major several times, he eventually focused on psychology and graduated in 1972. Studying psychology did not make Bundy an expert at reading other people's minds, but it suited the image he was trying to create. An educated man, a good listener, someone who understood how to communicate, and someone intelligent enough to enter places where few would ever expect a dangerous man to appear. For a time, Bundy worked at a crisis hotline in Seattle. The people who worked there spoke with callers in moments of desperation, helping them through potentially life-threatening situations. One of Bundy's co-workers would later become an author specializing in true crime. But even those who worked beside him failed to recognize what lay beneath his calm exterior. This is often used as proof that Bundy was a perfect actor. But perhaps the truth is simpler. People tend to judge others based on how they behave in a specific situation. Someone who knows how to speak to a person in crisis is not necessarily compassionate. Sometimes, they simply know how to perform the role expected of them. Bundy also began working on Republican political campaigns in Washington. He dressed well, communicated confidently, and knew how to make others believe he had a promising future. Some of those who knew him saw Bundy as a young man who could one day become a lawyer or politician. In his private life, Bundy was in a long-term relationship with Elizabeth Klopfer. Elizabeth was a single mother. She met Bundy in the late 1960s and gradually came to see him as part of her family. Bundy played with her daughter, went on outings with them, cooked meals, and helped with ordinary household chores. At times, he was gentle. At other times, distant. There were periods when he disappeared without offering any clear explanation. But at the time, Elizabeth had no reason to believe that the man sleeping beside her was connected to a string of crimes. In Ijotisen, Bundy was accepted into law school. He continued building the image of a man who understood the law, someone who could walk into a meeting room, a political office, or a courtroom without raising suspicion. But behind that image, Bundy was hiding another life. He often followed women, studied their routines, watched those who lived alone, those who had to walk through parking lots, or those who could disappear within minutes without anyone immediately noticing. No one knows exactly when Bundy began killing. He told different versions of the story. At times, he hinted that the crimes had begun much earlier. At other times, he avoided specific questions. Investigators were unable to verify most of his claims, but by the beginning of 1974, there was no longer any doubt. Ted Bundy had begun to hunt. The disappearances in Washington. In the early hours of January 4, 1974, a young woman in Seattle was attacked inside her own apartment. Her name was Karen Sparks. Karen was only 18 years old. The attacker broke in while she was sleeping and inflicted severe injuries. Karen survived, but those injuries affected her for most of her life. Years later, the attack would be recognized as one of the earliest crimes definitively linked to Ted Bundy. But, at the time, the police had no reason to connect it to the string of crimes that was about to unfold. Nearly a month later, on February 1, 1974, 21-year-old Linda Ann Healy disappeared from the basement room she rented in Seattle. Linda was a student at the University of Washington. She also worked at a local radio station, where she reported weather and snow conditions for skiers that morning. Linda failed to show up for work. Her family and friends quickly realized that something was wrong when investigators examined her room. They found signs that she had not left voluntarily. Linda's clothes were still there. Her personal belongings had not been taken, but Linda herself was gone. No one heard a cry for help. No one saw her leave the house. And no witness could say who had taken her. The police began searching, but they had no suspect, no vehicle to trace, and almost no clear crime scene to examine. Linda had simply vanished from a place where she should have been safe. In the weeks that followed, the disappearances continued. On March 12th, 19-year-old Donna Gail Manson left her room at Evergreen State College to attend a concert. Donna never arrived. On April 17th, 18-year-old Susan Rancourt disappeared from Central Washington State College. Before and after Susan vanished, several female students reported encountering a man with his arm in a sling. He claimed that he was injured, then asked them to help carry books or other belongings to a car parked nearby. Some refused. Others followed him, but turned back before reaching the car. At first, these accounts seemed like nothing more than strange encounters, but when placed side by side, they began to form a pattern. In May 1974, 20-year-old Roberta Kathy Parks disappeared from Oregon State University. This case occurred outside Washington. That made it even more difficult for the police to realize that they might be searching for the same man. On June 1st, 22-year-old Brenda Ball was last seen after leaving a bar near Seattle. 10 days later, 18-year-old Georgianne Hawkins disappeared while walking from her boyfriend's dormitory back to her sorority house. The distance was only a few hundred yards. The area was well lit. Georgianne was not walking through a completely deserted place. It should have taken only a few minutes to reach her room, but she never arrived the following morning. The police examined every part of the route. They searched the ground for even the smallest object. A button, a piece of fabric, a trace of blood, or any sign that a struggle had taken place. But they found almost nothing. Several witnesses later recalled seeing a man using crutches or wearing his arm in a sling. He appeared to be struggling to carry a briefcase. The car was described as a brown or light yellow Volkswagen Beetle. It was a common vehicle, and the man had no particularly unusual features. He was young, white, dark-haired, and relatively well-dressed, a description that could have matched thousands of men. The police began to recognize similarities among the victims. They were all young women. Many were college students. Most disappeared at night. The incidents often occurred near schools, construction sites, or parking areas. But recognizing a pattern did not mean they could identify the suspect. In EJUTC, the police did not have DNA analysis. Surveillance cameras were not installed on every street and inside every store. There were no mobile phones that could reveal a person's last known location, and there was no nationwide computer system capable of instantly connecting a disappearance in Washington to a case in Oregon. Each police department maintained its own records. Each disappearance could be treated as an isolated event, and without a body, investigators could not even be certain that they were investigating a murder. Some of the victims might have left voluntarily. They might have been involved in an accident. They might have been somewhere beyond the reach of their families. These were possibilities the police were forced to consider. But as more time passed, those possibilities became increasingly difficult to believe. Someone was making young women disappear from their lives, leaving no message, demanding no ransom, and leaving almost no trace behind. Then, on July 14, 1974, the man responsible changed everything. He walked into a crowded park, approached women in broad daylight, and used a name that the entire world would later come to know: Ted. Lake Sammamish. When the killer introduced himself. July 14, 1974. It was a warm summer day at Lake Sammamish State Park, east of Seattle. Thousands of people poured into the park. Families held picnics. Children played near the water. Groups of friends sunbathed or went boating. It was not the kind of place where anyone would expect an abduction to occur, and certainly not a place where a predator could operate unnoticed. But the crowds created a different kind of concealment. People saw countless faces, countless cars, countless brief conversations between strangers. No one had any reason to remember a man who had simply asked for a few minutes of help. The man was dressed in tennis clothes. One arm was held in a sling, as though it were injured. He approached several women and told them that he needed help moving a sailboat onto his car. He made no threats. He did not appear to be in a hurry. He did nothing to make the request seem unusual. And he introduced himself with a simple name, Ted. Several women refused. One agreed to follow him toward the parking lot, but when they reached the Volkswagen Beetle, she noticed that there was no sailboat. Sensing that something was wrong, she turned back. That decision may have saved her life, but not everyone recognized the danger in time. 23-year-old Janice Ann Ott was seen by several witnesses speaking with the man who called himself Ted. Janice was a juvenile court probation officer. She was seen leaving the area with him. Her motorcycle remained behind at the park. Approximately 4 hours later, 19-year-old Denise Nasland left her group of friends to use the restroom. She also disappeared. 2 women on the same day, from the same location, and both may have left with the same man. For the first time, the police had a large enough group of witnesses to reconstruct the suspect's behavior. They knew that he called himself Ted. They knew that he wore his arm in a sling. They knew that he drove a Volkswagen Beetle. They knew that he used a sailboat as a pretext for asking for help. And they knew that he was confident enough to approach several women in a crowded park. A composite sketch of the suspect was released. Newspapers began publishing information about the man named Ted. The police received thousands of calls. People reported coworkers, neighbors, acquaintances, former boyfriends. Anyone named Ted who owned a Volkswagen could become a suspect. Among the names reported to the police was Theodore Robert Bundy. But at the time, Bundy was only one name among many. He had a college degree. He had worked on political campaigns. He had no serious criminal record, and on the surface, he did not fit the image of a killer that many people imagined. Several months later, the first human remains were discovered in a remote area near Ithaca. Some were identified as belonging to Janice Ott and Denise Nasland. In early Ichu seawall, more remains were discovered at Taylor Mountain. The site gradually became one of the most important locations in the investigation. The police finally had proof that the missing women had not left voluntarily. They had been murdered, but the suspect still had not been identified. While investigators in Washington struggled to piece the clues together, Ted Bundy had already left the area. He moved to Utah, enrolled in law school, rented an apartment, and continued presenting himself as a perfectly ordinary student. The disappearances in Washington temporarily subsided, but in Utah, a new series of crimes was about to begin. Utah, a surviving victim. In the summer of 1974, Bundy moved to Salt Lake City to study law at the University of Utah. To those around him, he was simply a new student, a young man trying to build a career. No one knew that police in Washington had already received his name during the investigation into the missing women. Not long after Bundy arrived in Utah, the disappearances began. On October 2, 1974, Nancy Wilcox, a teenage girl from Holiday, disappeared. Her body was never found, and it would be many years before Bundy made statements believed to be connected to her disappearance. On October 18, 17-year-old Melissa Smith disappeared after leaving a pizza parlor in Midvale. Her father was the local police chief. A large-scale search was launched. 9 days later, Melissa's body was found in a mountainous area. On October 31st, 17-year-old Laura Ann Aney disappeared after leaving a Halloween party. Several weeks later, her body was discovered by hikers in American Fork Canyon. 2 teenage girls, less than 2 weeks apart, both disappeared at night. Both were found in remote areas. The police began considering the possibility that the cases were connected, but they still had no witness who had clearly seen the attacker. That changed on November 8, 1974 that afternoon. 18-year-old Carol Duranche was shopping at Fashion Place Mall in Murray, Utah. A man approached her. He claimed to be a police officer. He said his name was Officer Roseland. He told Carol that someone had attempted to break into her car and asked her to come with him to check whether anything had been stolen. Carol returned to the parking lot. She examined her car. There were no clear signs of a break-in. But the man continued, claiming that the suspect had already been arrested. He wanted Carol to go to the police station to identify the person and complete a report. Carol felt uncomfortable. She asked to see his police identification. The man showed her something that resembled a badge. Eventually, Carol agreed to get into his car. But it was not a police vehicle. It was a Volkswagen Beetle. As the car moved, Carol realized they were not heading toward the police station. She asked the man where he was taking her. He did not give a clear answer. Then, the car came to a stop. The man suddenly attempted to handcuff her. During the struggle, he made a mistake. Instead of locking Carol's hands together, both cuffs closed around the same wrist. Carol fought back, managed to open the car door, and threw herself outside. The man chased after her, but Carol kept running until another vehicle stopped to help. She was taken to the police. The handcuffs were still hanging from her wrist. Carol gave the police a description of her attacker. A young man, dark-haired, dressed in ordinary clothes, driving a Volkswagen Beetle, claiming to be a police officer. She had no idea that she had just escaped from the man the Washington police were searching for. Later that same evening, on November 8th, in Bountiful, Utah, 17-year-old Deborah Kent attended a performance at her high school. During the evening, a strange man was seen approaching several people inside the school. He used different excuses in an attempt to lure them into the parking lot. After the performance ended, Deborah left the auditorium to pick up her younger brother. She never returned. Near the parking lot, the police found a small key. It fit the handcuffs still attached to Carol Duranche's wrist. For the first time, investigators had more than just a missing person case. They had a survivor, a witness who could describe the attacker's face, a vehicle, a pair of handcuffs, and a very specific method of approach. The attacker did not only pretend to be injured, he could also impersonate someone in a position of authority. Bundy understood that many people were taught to help the injured and to obey the police. He turned those social instincts into tools for controlling his victims. Carol Duranche survived because she realized the road did not lead to a police station, because she asked questions, because she fought back, and because, at a critical moment, Bundy made a mistake. Years later, Carol's testimony would become one of the most important factors in putting Bundy behind bars. But at the end of 1974, the police still did not know the identity of the man she had described. Meanwhile, Elizabeth Klopfer was following the reports of the disappearances, and she began noticing far too many similarities between the suspect and the man living beside her. The girlfriend who called the police. When information about the man named Ted was released in Washington, Elizabeth Klopfer began to feel uneasy. The suspect used the name Ted. Her boyfriend was also named Ted. The suspect drove a Volkswagen Beetle. Bundy owned that exact type of car. Witnesses described a man using crutches or wearing his arm in a sling. Elizabeth had seen similar items among Bundy's belongings. The composite sketch also bore some resemblance to him. Each detail on its own could have been a coincidence. Ted was a common name. The Volkswagen Beetle was a common car. And the police sketch was not detailed enough to identify one specific person. But when all those details appeared together, Elizabeth could not completely ignore what she was feeling. She contacted the police, gave them the name Ted Bundy, information about his car, and the details that had made her suspicious. But the police were receiving thousands of tips. They had to investigate countless men named Ted. Some owned Volkswagens. Some resembled the composite sketch. Some had been near the locations where the women disappeared. Compared with the other names, Bundy did not appear to be the most obvious suspect. He had studied psychology. He had worked for the state government. He had participated in political campaigns. He was attending law school. He had no known history of serious violence. And when some witnesses were shown his photograph, they could not be certain that Bundy was the man they had encountered. His name did not disappear from the files entirely, but neither was he immediately placed at the top of the suspect list. Elizabeth continued her relationship with Bundy. Part of her was suspicious, but another part could not accept that the man she loved might be the person the police were searching for. It is easy to judge her in hindsight, but at the time, Elizabeth did not have access to the complete case files. She did not know what was happening in Utah. She had not seen the evidence the police would gather. Years later, she had only scattered pieces of information, and a man who could come home, speak as though everything were normal, play with her daughter, make plans for the future, and make every suspicion seem unreasonable. This story helped create the myth that Ted Bundy was so charming and intelligent that no one could recognize him for what he truly was. But Bundy did not need to deceive everyone. He only needed to create enough doubt to prevent anyone from acting. In time, the police needed evidence. Witnesses needed certainty. Those closest to him had to overcome the feeling that what they suspected was too horrifying to be true. In the gap between suspicion and proof, Bundy continued committing crimes. New cases appeared in Colorado, Idaho, and other parts of the American West. On January 12, 1975, 23-year-old Carrion Campbell disappeared from the Wildwood Inn resort in Colorado. She was walking from the lounge back to her hotel room. It was only a short distance, but Carrion never returned. Her body was found nearly a month later. Investigators in Colorado had no idea that the man they were searching for was living in Utah, and Bundy continued moving between multiple states. In the end, he was not arrested because of a complex murder investigation, not because the police had uncovered the entire pattern, but because a patrol officer noticed a car where it did not belong at a suspicious hour. The Volkswagen and the first arrest. In the early hours of August 16, 1975, Patrol Officer Bob Hayward was on duty in the Granger area of Utah. He noticed a Volkswagen Beetle driving through a residential neighborhood. The time of night and the way the car was moving caught his attention. As the patrol car approached, the driver of the Volkswagen accelerated. A brief chase followed. Eventually, the vehicle was stopped. The man behind the wheel was Theodore Robert Bundy. When the police searched the vehicle, they noticed that the front passenger seat had been removed and placed in the rear. Inside the car were several suspicious objects: handcuffs, a crowbar, rope, a ski mask, another mask fashioned from a stocking, bags, and other items that could have been used in a burglary or abduction. Bundy offered an explanation for each object. The mask was for skiing. He claimed that he had found the handcuffs somewhere else. The remaining tools were simply ordinary household items. Each explanation might have sounded reasonable on its own, but when everything was considered together, along with the front passenger seat being removed, the vehicle became deeply suspicious. At first, the police could not hold Bundy on a murder charge, but information about him was quickly passed to the investigators handling the Carol Duranch case. The type of car matched, his appearance matched, the handcuffs matched the attacker's method, and the name Bundy had already appeared among the tips received in Washington. Carol was brought in to identify him. She identified Bundy as the man who had impersonated a police officer and attempted to abduct her. Now, the scattered pieces began to connect. The Volkswagen at Lake Sammamish, the man named Ted, Elizabeth Klopfer's call to the police, the attempted abduction of Carol Duranch, the items found inside Bundy's car, and Bundy's movements across multiple states where young women had disappeared. In February 1976, Bundy went on trial in Utah for the abduction of Carol Duranch. He chose a trial without a jury. Carol entered the courtroom and once again identified Bundy as the man who had attacked her. Bundy tried to project an image of calmness. At times, he smiled. At times, he behaved as though Carol's testimony could not be trusted. But the judge was not convinced. Bundy was found guilty of aggravated kidnapping. In June 1976, he was sentenced to between 1 and 15 years in prison. It was not yet a sentence for any of the murders, but for the first time, Ted Bundy was off the streets. While he was in custody, investigators from several states continued exchanging information. Colorado authorities focused on the murder of Karen Campbell. They determined that Bundy had been at the resort when Karen disappeared. Evidence related to his travels, his vehicle, and other traces caused suspicion to grow. By the end of 1976, Colorado formally charged Bundy in connection with Karen Campbell's death. In January 1977, he was transferred to Colorado to face trial. Bundy decided to take part in his own defense. That allowed him access to legal materials, greater freedom of movement inside the courthouse, and in some situations, he was not required to wear handcuffs in front of the judge. These rights were granted to ensure a fair trial, but Bundy saw them as an opportunity. On June 7, 1977, that opportunity appeared. The two prison escapes. On the morning of June 7, 1977, Bundy was transported from the Garfield County Jail to the courthouse in Aspen, Colorado. He was scheduled to attend a preliminary hearing in the Karen Campbell case. Because he was participating in his own defense, Bundy was allowed to use the courthouse law library to review the case files. He was not wearing handcuffs. A guard stood outside. For a brief period, Bundy was left alone. He walked to a second-story window, opened it, and jumped to the ground. The fall injured his ankle, but Bundy was still able to move. He quickly fled downtown Aspen. By the time court officials discovered the empty room, Bundy had disappeared. Local police immediately set up roadblocks. Aircraft were deployed. Search teams moved into the mountains. The FBI issued a federal warrant for his arrest. But Bundy did not attempt to flee the area immediately. He hid in the mountains near Aspen, broke into a vacation cabin to steal food and clothing for several days. He moved through the rugged forest terrain, sometimes becoming lost and being forced to turn back. Eventually, Bundy stole a car. 6 days after the escape, he was spotted by the police and taken back into custody. His first escape had failed. Bundy was returned to jail. This time, security measures were increased, but not enough. Over the following months, Bundy quietly prepared for a second escape. He lost weight, studied the structure of his cell, and discovered a space above the ceiling that could lead to another area of the jail. On the night of December 30th, 1977, Bundy put his plan into action. He climbed through a hole in the ceiling of his cell, crawled through the narrow space above, and made his way into the jail staff's living quarters. There, Bundy found civilian clothing, changed out of his prison uniform, and walked out of the building. No alarm sounded immediately. There was no pursuit. For hours, the jail staff had no idea that one of America's most dangerous murder suspects had disappeared. That delay gave Bundy a significant advantage. He left Colorado, traveled through several cities, used stolen cars, changed vehicles, and made his way toward the southeastern United States. By the time the authorities discovered his empty cell, Bundy was already far away. A nationwide manhunt was launched. The FBI distributed wanted posters. His fingerprints and identifying information were sent to law enforcement agencies across the country. On February 10, 1978, Bundy was added to the FBI's 10 Most Wanted Fugitives list. But before his name appeared on that list, Bundy had already reached Florida. He chose Tallahassee, a city filled with college students, rental housing, and young people constantly arriving and leaving. Bundy rented a room under the false name Chris Hagen. He had no steady job, no vehicle of his own, and none of the carefully organized life he had maintained before. He survived on stolen money and credit cards, moved constantly under the fear of being recognized, and could no longer maintain the appearance of normality for long. Just over 2 weeks after arriving in Tallahassee, Bundy entered the Chi Omega sorority house. What happened that night was a direct consequence of his 2 escapes. If Bundy had been properly secured, Margaret Bowman, Lisa Levy, and Kimberly Leach might never have become some of his final victims. The final attack in Florida. In the early hours of January 15, 1978, the area surrounding Florida State University had almost fallen silent. Many students had returned to their rooms after a weekend night out at the Chi Omega sorority house. Most of the residents were asleep. At approximately 10 a.m., a man entered the building. There were no signs that he had forced his way inside. He moved upstairs. Within a very short period of time, 4 young women were attacked in their bedrooms. Margaret Bowman and Lisa Levy were murdered. Kathy Kleiner and Karen Chandler were seriously injured, but survived. When Nita Neary, a member of Chi Omega, returned, she heard footsteps, then saw a man standing near the front door. He was wearing light-colored pants, a dark jacket, a hat, and he was carrying an object that resembled a wooden club. Nita saw him for only a few seconds. The man quickly left the building. At first, those inside did not realize how serious the situation was. It was only when one of the injured victims emerged from her room that the police and emergency medical personnel were called. But the attack was not over. After leaving Chi Omega, the attacker walked to a house several blocks away. He broke into the apartment of 21-year-old Cheryl Thomas. Cheryl was also attacked. While she slept, she survived, but she suffered injuries that caused lasting damage to her hearing and sense of balance. 5 women were attacked in less than an hour. 2 were killed. 3 survived with severe injuries. Tallahassee was gripped by fear. The police did not yet know that Ted Bundy was living nearby, but the nature of the crimes led investigators to consider the possibility that the attacker was experienced. Someone capable of moving quickly, attacking in silence, and willing to strike even when many people were close by. Several weeks passed. Bundy continued living under a false name. He stole to obtain money, moved from place to place, and tried to avoid police attention. On February 9, 1978, in Lake City, more than 90 miles from Tallahassee, 12-year-old Kimberly Leach disappeared from her school. It happened in broad daylight. Kimberly was in the middle of the school day when her family and school officials realized she was missing. A large-scale search was launched. But Bundy had already left the area 2 months later. Kimberly's body was found in a remote location. She is considered the final confirmed victim in Ted Bundy's series of crimes. Less than a week after Kimberly disappeared, in the early hours of February 15, 1978, a police officer in Pensacola spotted an orange Volkswagen Beetle driving along the road. Its license plate had been stolen. When the officer signaled for the vehicle to stop, the driver did not immediately comply. After the car was finally stopped, he resisted arrest. A struggle followed. Eventually, the man was subdued. He gave a false name. He had no valid identification. The police had no idea who they had just captured. The man's fingerprints were sent for examination. Not long afterward, the results came back. The man being held in Pensacola was Theodore Robert Bundy, the fugitive who had escaped from custody twice, one of the most wanted men in America, and a suspect in a series of disappearances stretching from Washington to Florida. This time, Bundy had nowhere left to run. But even in custody, he refused to give up his efforts to control how the public saw him. The courtroom would become his new stage, and Ted Bundy would turn his murder trial into one of the greatest media spectacles of the era. The trial became a spectacle. In the summer of 1979, Ted Bundy went on trial for the attacks at the Chi Omega sorority house in Cheryl Thomas's apartment. Because of the enormous publicity surrounding the case, the trial was moved to Miami. Television cameras were allowed to record the proceedings. Bundy's face appeared on television screens across America. For many people, it was the first time they had seen a suspected serial killer who looked nothing like the image they had imagined. Bundy did not appear out of control. He wore a suit, combed his hair neatly, sat beside his attorneys, read through case files, asked questions, and frequently looked directly into the cameras. Bundy had a defense team, but he wanted to participate in every decision. He had studied law, understood some legal procedures, and believed that he could read the jury better than the lawyers representing him. At times, Bundy rejected the advice of his own defense team. He did not simply want to avoid the death penalty, he wanted to control the entire narrative. The prosecution presented several categories of evidence. Nita Neary described the moment she saw a man leaving the Chi Omega sorority house. Other witnesses confirmed that Bundy had been seen in the surrounding area on the evening before the attacks. The police also described occasions when he fled or behaved suspiciously after encountering patrol officers in the weeks that followed. Hair samples collected from the Cheryl Thomas crime scene were also compared, but the evidence that attracted the most attention was the bite mark found on Lisa Levy's body. Dental experts photographed the mark, made impressions of Bundy's teeth, and then claimed that the shape of his teeth matched the bite mark found at the scene. Comparison images were shown to the jury. At the time, bite mark analysis was considered a forensic technique that could help identify a suspect. But decades later, scientific research raised serious questions about the reliability of this method. Human skin can stretch, swell, and change over time. A mark left on skin does not necessarily preserve the exact shape of a person's teeth. Modern experts have also been unable to prove that every individual possesses a dental pattern unique enough to support the kind of identification once claimed. That does not mean the entire case against Bundy rested on a single unreliable piece of evidence. The bite mark was a prominent part of the prosecution's case. But prosecutors also presented eyewitness testimony. Bundy's movements around the area, other physical evidence, and his behavior after the attacks. On July 24, 1979, after several hours of deliberation, the jury found Ted Bundy guilty 2 counts of first-degree murder, 3 counts of attempted first-degree murder, and 2 counts of burglary. Bundy received 2 death sentences for the murders of Margaret Bowman and Lisa Levy, but the Florida cases were not over. In Idiobaline, Bundy went on trial for the kidnapping and murder of Kimberly Leach. During the trial, a strange scene unfolded. Bundy called Carol Ann Boone, a longtime friend who had publicly supported him, to the witness stand. In open court, the two declared themselves married. According to their interpretation of Florida law at the time, a declaration made before a judge was enough to create a legal marriage. The moment quickly became national news. Once again, public attention shifted away from the victim, away from a 12-year-old girl who had disappeared during the school day, and toward Ted Bundy, who he was marrying, how he smiled, what he said to the cameras. That was the power of the performance. Bundy did not need to convince the entire public that he was innocent. He only needed to keep everyone watching him. In February 1980, Bundy was convicted of kidnapping and murdering Kimberly Leach. He received his 3rd death sentence. Legally, Bundy's future had almost certainly been decided, but the appeals process could continue for years. During that time, he continued receiving letters from supporters, continued giving interviews, and continued claiming that he was innocent. Ted Bundy had been convicted of 3 murders in Florida, but investigators believed that his list of victims was far longer. They needed Bundy to tell the truth, and Bundy understood that, as long as he held on to those secrets, he still had something to bargain with. 30 confessions, and the secrets left unanswered. For nearly a decade, Ted Bundy lived on Florida's death row. His lawyers continued filing appeals. Several execution dates were scheduled, and then postponed. Bundy pursued every legal avenue available to him. During interviews, he often avoided making direct admissions. At times, Bundy spoke about a hypothetical killer, describing that person's thoughts and behavior in the 3rd person. This allowed him to reveal information without publicly accepting responsibility. It also helped Bundy maintain a sense of control. He could bring the conversation close to the truth, then stop. He could make the interviewer believe that a confession was about to come, then suddenly change the subject. In the mid-18 Josher Balian S, while Washington authorities were searching for the Green River Killer, Bundy offered insights into the killer's psychology. He spoke with some of the same investigators who had once pursued him. He analyzed how a killer might choose locations, how he might return to the places where bodies had been left, and why the killer might want to control the investigation from a distance. Some of these observations may have come from Bundy's own behavior, but being allowed to participate in a major investigation also helped him feel important again. He was no longer simply a prisoner waiting to die. He wanted to be seen as someone who possessed knowledge the police needed. By the end of 1988, Bundy's avenues of appeal were gradually closing. His execution was scheduled for January 1989. This time, there was almost no possibility of another delay. Bundy changed his strategy. He announced that he was willing to discuss unsolved cases. Investigators quickly traveled to Florida. They knew that very little time remained. Each of them carried a list, a map, photographs, and questions from families who had been waiting for years. Bundy began accepting responsibility for crimes in Washington, Utah, Colorado, Idaho, Oregon, California, and Florida. He spoke about identified victims, missing women whose bodies had never been found, and several women whose names did not appear in police records. Bundy claimed responsibility for approximately 30 murders, including She in Washington, 8 in Utah, 3 in Colorado, 3 in Florida, 2 in Oregon, 2 in Idaho, and 1 in California. But these numbers were based largely on Bundy's own accounts. Not every claim was supported by physical evidence. Some of the confessions helped investigators better understand old cases. Some matched details that had never been made public, but many of Bundy's accounts remained incomplete. He might confirm that he had killed someone, but failed to provide enough information to locate the body. At times, he claimed that he had forgotten the location. At times, he described an area that was far too large. At times, he simply refused to say more. Investigators believed that Bundy was using the truth as a form of leverage. If he still possessed information about missing victims, perhaps the authorities would keep him alive for a few more days, a few more weeks, or even longer. But the state of Florida refused to grant another delay. Bundy had years to talk. Only when death became unavoidable did he begin providing information. Even then, the families remained dependent on whether a man who had lied for years would finally choose to tell the truth. On the night before his execution, Bundy gave one final interview. He spoke about the factors he believed had influenced his development. But even during that interview, he still avoided taking full responsibility, still searched for an external cause, an explanation that might make his actions seem easier to understand. But no book, no film, no failed relationship, and no childhood memory could, by itself, turn someone into Ted Bundy. He made choices, repeated those choices, planned, concealed, lied, and continued even while fully understanding the consequences for his victims and their families. On the morning of January 24th, 1989, Ted Bundy was led out of his cell outside the prison. The crowd continued to wait. Some people celebrated. Some victims' families remained silent. For them, Bundy's death could not bring their loved ones back, nor could it answer all the questions that remained. At 10:15 a.m., Ted Bundy was pronounced dead after being executed in the electric chair. He was 42 years old. A white hearse left the prison. The crowd outside cheered. But across America, families still had no bodies to bury, no complete account of what had happened, and no way of knowing whether their loved ones were among the victims. Bundy never revealed. His death brought the sentence to an end, but it did not bring the case to a complete close. The monster everyone thought they could recognize. More than 3 decades have passed since Ted Bundy was executed, yet his name continues to appear in books, documentaries, television programs, discussions about criminal psychology, and unresolved missing person cases. Each generation seems to rediscover the story of Ted Bundy in a different way. Some people are fascinated by his 2 prison escapes. Others are drawn to his courtroom performance. Some search for a single event in his childhood that might explain everything. But when too much attention is focused on Bundy, it becomes easy to forget something important. This story did not begin with him. It began with women who had lives, families, and futures of their own. Linda Ann Healy was not simply the first known victim. She was a student, a daughter, a young woman with a job and people waiting for her to arrive on the morning of February 1st, 1974. Janice Ott was not simply the woman who followed a man at Lake Sammamish. Denise Naslund was not simply the woman who disappeared a few hours later. Carol Duranche was not merely the woman who escaped from Bundy. Her presence of mind, resistance, and testimony helped put him behind bars. Kathy Kleiner, Karen Chandler, Cheryl Thomas, and Karen Sparks were not merely survivors. They had to live with the consequences of attacks that the public often summarizes in only a few sentences. Kimberly Leach was not simply the final victim. She was a 12-year-old girl taken from her school by a man who should have been behind bars. When the entire case is viewed from that perspective, Ted Bundy no longer appears to be a criminal mastermind. He was a predator who knew how to exploit very specific weaknesses: the kindness of strangers, respect for authority, the belief that a dangerous person must look frightening, the lack of communication between police agencies, and the assumption that an educated man could not be hiding a life of violence. Bundy did not need to hypnotize his victims. He only needed to appear ordinary. An injured man asking for help carrying books. A police officer who wanted to ask a few questions. A law student asking for directions. A polite man standing beside his car. He understood that many people did not want to appear rude, did not want to suspect someone who had done nothing obviously wrong, and often recognized the danger only when they were already too close. The cases also exposed the limitations of the investigative system. In the 1970s, a disappearance in Washington might remain inside one set of files. A body found in Utah might be investigated by an entirely different agency. A case in Colorado might not immediately be connected to a car previously seen in Seattle. As Bundy moved across state lines, jurisdictional boundaries unintentionally became a layer of protection for him. His 2 escapes also demonstrated the danger of underestimating a suspect. Bundy did not escape because he possessed extraordinary abilities. The first time he was left alone in a law library without handcuffs. The second time, a hole in the ceiling of his cell was not discovered or secured in time. Those failures gave him the opportunity to reach Florida, and his final 3 victims paid the price. The trial exposed another problem: the media's ability to place the perpetrator at the center of the story. Cameras captured every smile, every gesture, every word Bundy spoke. The public began debating his appearance, his confidence, his intelligence, and his ability to perform. Meanwhile, the names and lives of many victims were gradually reduced to a list. This may have been the final victory Bundy wanted: to be remembered, to be studied, to be transformed into a mystery that people would continue trying to solve. But Ted Bundy is not a completely incomprehensible mystery. He was a man who knew how to lie, how to plan, how to exploit trust, and who repeatedly chose to harm others. What remains unanswered is not whether he was guilty, it is the full extent of what he did. In Arlene Arlou, more than half a century after the death of Laura Ann Aim, modern DNA testing confirmed that Ted Bundy was the man who murdered her. Bundy had accepted responsibility before his execution, But, at the time, his word alone was not enough for authorities to close the case. Only when science advanced did physical evidence provide the final answer. The discovery shows that this story is still not entirely over. Old evidence can still be re-examined. Unsolved cases can still be reopened, and families who have waited for decades may still receive answers. Perhaps we will never know exactly how many people Ted Bundy killed. We may never recover all the bodies, never identify every unnamed victim, and never know which confession contained the complete truth, which revealed only part of it, and which was created so that Bundy could continue controlling those who listened. But one thing is almost certain. Ted Bundy did not exist apart from society. He lived within it. He learned how to use ordinary social conventions, first impressions, and human trust to conceal his true nature. That may be the most frightening part of the entire story. Not that Ted Bundy looked like a monster, but that he looked nothing like one. And perhaps the most important question is not how many people did Ted Bundy truly kill, but rather, how many warning signs were ignored simply because he did not resemble what people imagined a killer should look like.